I want to speak about marriage as a real decision, with real consequences in the real world, especially in the country where I was born, trained, and built everything I have ever known. I need to be careful, not because the truth is fragile, but because the world has a habit of turning careful words into weapons. This is not a confession driven by anger. This is not a tantrum. This is not an attempt to punish fans, media, or Korea itself. This is me trying to explain something that is rarely explained honestly. The mechanism, the system, the reality of what happens when an idol like me considers choosing the most ordinary human future. The truth itself is simple, and that simplicity is exactly what makes it dangerous. If I get married in Korea, the marriage does not remain a private promise between two people. It does not stay inside a home. It does not stay inside love. It becomes a public trial. It becomes a marketplace. It becomes a battlefield. It becomes a test of loyalty that no human being should ever be forced to take. For many years, I told myself that my dream was Korea, not just as an artist, not just as a trainee who learned how to survive inside practice rooms and schedules, but as a son who wanted his parents to be proud, as a man who wanted his future to exist in the same language as his childhood. I believed that if I worked hard enough, stayed respectful enough, stayed humble enough, I could earn the right to be both loved and left alone. I believed the stage could be my home, and the country could be my shelter. I believed that love and privacy were not unreasonable things to want. But slowly, almost invisibly, I watched the definition of love change around people like us. At first, it happened quietly, like an edit no one notices until the meaning is no longer the same. Love became something the public felt entitled to supervise. Privacy became something you had to request instead of expect. A normal life became something you had to apologize for wanting. And marriage, more than anything else, became a forbidden door. Not because marriage is wrong, but because marriage proves you are human in a way the machine of fame cannot fully control. I used to think the pressure placed on idols was simply the price of success. I told myself that every career demands sacrifice, that every dream has weight. I believed it the way you believe gravity exists, the way you accept the sky is above you without questioning it. But over time, I began to see a pattern that went beyond ordinary fame. It was not only fans. It was not only journalists. It was not only comments online. It was an entire ecosystem. An ecosystem that rewards silence and punishes honesty. An ecosystem that teaches you to become your own prison guard. It teaches you to censor yourself before anyone even speaks. It teaches you to anticipate punishment and call it responsibility. The moment marriage enters the conversation, the rules change. People say they want honesty, but what they often want is control. They say they care about your happiness, but what they really care about is stability. They say they support your growth, but only if that growth does not disturb the image they already purchased in their mind. In Korea, where the idol system is both art and industry, both culture and commerce, the word marriage does not land like a personal milestone. It lands like a threat to a business model. When I say this is what happens, I am not speaking emotionally. I am speaking structurally. There is a chain reaction. It begins with speculation. Speculation becomes narrative. Narrative becomes pressure. Pressure becomes demands. Demands become consequences. And in the middle of that chain, a human being is expected to keep smiling while the walls quietly move closer. It starts with small things. A ring becomes evidence. A glance becomes proof. A private meal becomes breaking news. A lyric becomes a confession in someone else's mouth. Every gesture is stripped of its real meaning and rebuilt into a story that sells. People do not simply watch you. They interpret you. They create a version of you and punish you for not living inside it perfectly. Then the process moves behind the scenes, into rooms where the air feels clean but the words are sharp. Meetings that should be about music slowly turn into meetings about risk. Conversations that should be about creativity become conversations about timing. The questions stop being about what you want to express and start being about what you are allowed to say. And the most painful part is how gently it is delivered. Not with shouting, not with open cruelty, but with polite faces, professional tones, carefully chosen phrases that sound reasonable until you realize they are asking you to erase yourself. The warnings arrive like weather reports. If this becomes public, there may be backlash. If the backlash grows, brands may hesitate. If brands hesitate, partnerships may change. And if partnerships change, the cost will not fall on you alone. It will fall on staff, on teams, on schedules, on people whose livelihoods depend on the machine staying stable. The warning is designed to feel like compassion, but it functions like a leash. It makes your personal life feel like a bomb strapped to other people's survival. It turns love into guilt. I have lived long enough inside this system to know how quickly everything can pivot. One day you are celebrated as proof of national pride. The next day you are treated like a risk that needs to be managed. It is rarely spoken directly, but you feel it in the shift of energy, in the way conversations become careful, in the way warmth turns into distance. You feel it when people stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a brand that must be protected from your own humanity. That is where the real violence happens, not physical violence, a quieter kind, the violence of being turned into a symbol that is not allowed to change, the violence of being told without words that your life belongs to the public more than it belongs to you. And this is only the beginning of what happens when marriage becomes real. When people imagine the impact of marriage on an idol, they usually imagine the idol first, the headline face, the name that trends, the image that changes overnight. What almost no one imagines is the person standing beside him, suddenly pulled into a world she never auditioned for, never trained for, never agreed to survive. The moment marriage becomes real, the spotlight does not widen, it sharpens, and it does not stop at me. The partner becomes the first casualty of curiosity disguised as concern. Her past is no longer her own. Her present is no longer private. Her future is no longer allowed to be quiet. Everything she has ever posted, said, liked, worn, or avoided becomes material for interpretation. Not because she did something wrong, but because proximity to fame turns ordinary history into evidence. People say they just want to know who she is, but what they really want is to decide whether she deserves to exist next to you. This is where the cruelty becomes most obvious. She is not judged as a human being. She is judged as a role. Is she worthy? Is she careful enough? Is she invisible enough? Is she grateful enough? Is she strong enough to be hated quietly? There is an expectation that she must accept scrutiny as the price of love, that if she truly cares, she will endure being stripped down to fragments by strangers, that if she struggles, it is because she was not prepared enough, not because the situation itself is unreasonable. In Korea, the idol system has never learned how to protect the unseen person standing next to the star. It knows how to manage images. It knows how to manage schedules. It knows how to manage outrage. What it does not know how to manage is a private life that refuses to stay invisible. And once the partner is pulled into the current, the narrative spreads outward. Marriage is never treated as an individual choice. It is treated as a structural disruption. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about love. It is about timing, about impact, about damage control, about what comes next. For a group like BTS, where the story has always been larger than any one person, the pressure multiplies in silence. The system does not ask directly. It never says, "Do not do this." Instead, it asks questions that sound neutral but carry weight. How will fans react? How will the market shift? How will international perception change? How will this affect group momentum? And beneath those questions is the unspoken implication that personal happiness is a variable that must be balanced against collective stability. I have always believed that what we built together was rooted in sincerity, that the bond between members was not a concept but a lived reality, and that belief is exactly why this becomes so complicated. Because when you care deeply about people, pressure does not need to be loud to be effective. It only needs to be present. The idea that a personal decision could ripple outward and touch the livelihoods, emotions, and futures of people you love is not theoretical. It is made very real, very quickly. And once that idea is planted, it grows. It grows into hesitation, into second-guessing, into silence. You begin to ask yourself questions that should never belong to love. Is my happiness selfish? Is my timing wrong? Is my desire unfair? You start measuring your personal life in terms of acceptable losses. You start negotiating with yourself before anyone else ever has to. This is how the system survives, not through force but through internalization. You learn to regulate your own joy. Publicly, the language remains supportive. People say they respect your choice. They say they understand. But support often comes with conditions. Respect often comes with limits. Understanding often disappears the moment reality does not behave the way they imagined. And when backlash comes, it rarely looks the way people expect. It is not always loud anger. Sometimes it is withdrawal, silence, distance, a slow cooling of enthusiasm that is harder to confront than open hate. Projects are reconsidered. Opportunities are delayed. Invitations become uncertain, not because anyone says no directly, but because risk is now attached to your name. You are no longer just an artist. You are a calculation. This is the point where many idols learn the real lesson. That success does not buy freedom. It only buys a more carefully managed cage. The higher you rise, the more valuable stability becomes to the people around you. And stability is defined by predictability, not authenticity. Marriage threatens predictability. It reminds everyone that you are aging, that you are changing, that your life is moving forward whether the industry is ready or not. And for a system built on freezing time, that reminder is uncomfortable. Fans are often placed at the center of this conflict, but they are not the root. Fans react within the boundaries they are taught. The real architecture exists deeper, where image, profit, and narrative intersect, where an idol's humanity is acknowledged only when it can be packaged safely. I want to be clear about something. This is not about blaming fans for feeling emotions. Love creates attachment. Attachment creates fear of loss. That is human. What is not human is building an entire industry that relies on encouraging that fear while pretending it does not exist. Marriage exposes that contradiction in a way nothing else can. Because once you stand beside someone publicly, once you choose permanence, the illusion cracks. The illusion that you exist solely for consumption. The illusion that your future belongs to everyone equally. The illusion that your silence means consent. And when illusions crack, systems react. They react by tightening control, by emphasizing responsibility, by reminding you of everything that could go wrong. They remind you of your influence, of your role, of your obligation. They remind you that being loved by millions also means being owned, just a little by expectation. This is the stage where many stories end quietly, where plans are postponed indefinitely, where love is pushed into the future with the promise that someday will be safer, where people tell themselves they are being mature when they are really being managed. But this is not the end of the truth. Because the most difficult part is not what happens publicly, or professionally, or structurally. The most difficult part is what happens internally, when you begin to realize that the life you imagine for yourself exists just outside the boundaries of what you are allowed to choose. And that realization changes everything. And you realize that your public identity and your private self are no longer moving in the same direction. For a long time, I believed balance was possible, that I could be an idol on stage and a normal man off it, that I could perform intensity without living inside it, that I could draw a clean line between what the world sees and what belongs only to me. But when marriage enters the conversation, that line begins to blur. You start noticing how often you are performing even when no one is watching, how carefully you choose words in private conversations, how instinctively you hide parts of yourself, not because you are told to, but because you have learned that visibility has consequences. This is not paranoia, it is conditioning. Over years, you are trained to anticipate reaction before action, to imagine backlash before honesty, to evaluate impact before emotion. Eventually, this way of thinking stops feeling external and starts feeling like your own voice. That is when silence becomes dangerous, because silence begins to feel safe. You tell yourself you are protecting people. You tell yourself you are being responsible. You tell yourself that now is not the right time, that later will be easier, that patience is maturity. And maybe sometimes that is true. But when silence becomes permanent, it stops being patience and starts becoming erasure. I have watched talented people around me slowly disappear inside roles they outgrew, not because they failed, but because they adapted too well. They learned how to survive in a shape that no longer fit them. And survival, when prolonged, can look a lot like success from the outside. Marriage forces a confrontation with that reality. It asks a simple question that cannot be negotiated forever. Who are you when the cameras turn away? Who are you choosing to become when no one is counting your steps? Who do you want beside you when the applause ends? These questions do not care about branding. They do not care about timing. They do not care about optics. And that is exactly why they are inconvenient. The internal conflict sharpens when you realize that the public version of you is often rewarded for qualities that require you to remain incomplete. Youth without aging, availability without commitment, warmth without attachment, passion without permanence. Marriage contradicts all of that. It declares continuity. It signals grounding. It says this life is not temporary, not interchangeable, not endlessly flexible. And for an industry built on perpetual openness, that declaration feels like closure. The pressure does not arrive as a command. It arrives as doubt. Are you sure this is necessary right now? Are you sure this is worth the risk? Are you sure you are ready for what comes next? At first, you ask these questions out of caution. Then you ask them out of fear. Eventually, you ask them out of habit. Fear has a way of disguising itself as logic. You start scanning your own desires for flaws. You look for reasons to delay. You convince yourself that wanting stability means you are losing ambition, that choosing one person means abandoning millions, that grounding yourself means slowing down. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to see your own happiness as a liability. This is where the emotional toll becomes heavy. Because love, when treated as a threat, changes shape. It becomes something you protect instead of celebrate, something you hide instead of share, something you compartmentalize instead of live inside fully. You begin living two parallel lives, one that is visible and carefully curated, one that is private and constantly guarded. The gap between those lives grows wider with time, and crossing it becomes exhausting. You start to feel like a guest in your own future. The identity conflict deepens when public narratives no longer match internal reality. People praise you for devotion while you feel fragmented. They admire your discipline while you feel restrained. They celebrate your consistency while you feel stagnant. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. From the inside, something feels unfinished. This is the quiet burnout that does not come from overwork, but from self-denial, from constantly postponing personal milestones because they do not align with expectations written by others. And the most isolating part is that you are not encouraged to talk about it. Expressing doubt can be interpreted as weakness. Expressing desire can be interpreted as selfishness. Expressing conflict can be interpreted as ingratitude. So you learn to compress your emotions into manageable shapes. You smile. You reassure. You redirect. And in doing so, you become very good at being understood without being known. Marriage challenges that performance. It asks you to stand still long enough to be seen clearly, to accept that clarity will upset some people, to accept that not everyone will follow you into the next chapter, to accept that growth always includes loss. That acceptance is not easy, especially when your entire career has been built on connection. There is guilt involved, guilt for wanting more, guilt for changing, guilt for imagining a life that does not revolve entirely around consumption. But guilt is not the same as wrongdoing, and that distinction matters. The hardest realization is this: no matter how carefully you live, no matter how much you sacrifice, there will always be someone who feels disappointed when you choose yourself. The system teaches you to avoid that disappointment at all costs, but adulthood teaches you something different. That avoidance has a cost too. It costs authenticity. It costs peace. It costs time. And time is the one thing you cannot rehearse forever. This is why the internal conflict cannot be ignored indefinitely, because at some point, the question stops being whether marriage will change your career. The question becomes whether postponing your life will change who you are. And once that question is asked honestly, silence no longer feels safe. It feels like surrender. There comes a point when hesitation stops protecting you and starts imprisoning you. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive with a single event or a sudden announcement. It arrives gradually, through exhaustion, through the quiet realization that you have been standing at the edge of your own life, waiting for permission that may never come. This is the point where decision begins to take shape. For a long time, I believed that speaking honestly would only make things harder. That silence was the responsible choice. That restraint was proof of maturity. I believed that if I carried the weight quietly enough, no one else would have to feel it. But silence has a cost that is rarely acknowledged. It distorts reality. It allows other people to speak for you. It turns speculation into truth simply because no alternative exists. When you do not tell your story, someone else will, and they will tell it in a way that serves their needs, not your humanity. I began to understand that the danger was no longer in speaking, but in being permanently misunderstood. This is where many idols reach a breaking point, not because they want attention, but because they want alignment. They want their public image to stop drifting further away from who they actually are. They want their words to catch up to their life. The idea of marriage forces that alignment into the open. You cannot half-step into it. You cannot suggest permanence while pretending nothing will change. Marriage is clarity, and clarity disrupts systems that rely on ambiguity to survive. Once you begin considering honesty, the risks become clearer, but so does the alternative. The risk of speaking is backlash. The risk of not speaking is erosion. Erosion of self-trust. Erosion of intimacy. Erosion of the future you are quietly postponing. At this stage, fear changes shape. It stops being about what others might do to you and starts being about what you might do to yourself if you continue denying reality. I had to ask myself a difficult question, not whether the world was ready for my truth, but whether I was ready to live without it. That question reframes everything. It shifts the focus away from reaction and toward consequence. Not immediate consequence, but long-term consequence. What kind of person do you become when you repeatedly choose safety over sincerity? What kind of life do you build when you are always waiting for the perfect condition that never arrives? The industry is built on delay. Delay announcements, delay change, delay adulthood, delay closure. It thrives on the idea that tomorrow is always safer than today. But tomorrow is a moving target. It keeps retreating the closer you get. There's a quiet courage required to stop waiting. Speaking honestly does not mean demanding approval. It means accepting that approval is not guaranteed. It means understanding that some people will feel hurt, some will feel betrayed, and some will feel relieved. All of those reactions can coexist, and none of them fully define your intent. When an idol speaks about marriage honestly, the act itself becomes symbolic. It signals a refusal to be frozen in time. It signals that growth will continue with or without consensus. This is deeply unsettling for a system that profits from predictability. Predictability allows for planning. Planning allows for profit. Profit allows for control. Marriage disrupts that equation because it introduces a variable that cannot be managed forever. A partner, a family, a life that operates outside schedules and contracts. That disruption is why honesty feels dangerous. But danger is not always destruction. Sometimes it is transition. The fear that honesty will destroy everything is often exaggerated by people who benefit from things staying exactly as they are. The truth is more complicated. Some doors close, others open quietly. Some connections weaken, others deepen. What changes most is not the world, but your position within it. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop apologizing for existing fully. You stop asking whether your future is allowed. That shift does not happen overnight. It begins internally, long before anything is said publicly. It begins the moment you accept that your life is not a draft meant to be endlessly revised for comfort. Choosing to speak does not mean you are no longer grateful. It does not erase love for fans, for music, for the journey that made everything possible. Gratitude and autonomy are not enemies. They are only framed that way when control is at stake. I have always believed that connection built on honesty is stronger than connection built on illusion. Illusions feel powerful until they crack. Honesty feels fragile until it proves resilient. Marriage in this context is not rebellion. It is declaration. A declaration that growth is not betrayal, that choosing permanence is not abandoning passion, that grounding yourself does not mean disappearing. The moment you accept this, the fear begins to lose its authority. It does not vanish, but it no longer commands every decision. And that is when the final question emerges. Not whether you can survive the reaction, but whether you can live with the silence any longer. Because at some point, protecting an image starts to feel like betraying a life. Once honesty enters the public space, it no longer belongs only to the person who spoke it. It begins to move. It is picked up, reshaped, simplified, amplified, and sometimes distorted. This is the moment many people fear the most because it feels like stepping into weather you cannot control. The reaction does not arrive all at once. It comes in waves. The first wave is noise. Headlines race each other. Words are extracted from context and placed into frames designed to attract attention. Questions are asked loudly, even when answers are already implied. Every sentence is examined not for meaning, but for potential controversy. This is where fear imagines chaos, where people expect collapse. But chaos is rarely the dominant emotion. Confusion is. Some fans feel hurt, not because of the truth itself, but because it interrupts a story they were emotionally invested in. Others feel protective, suddenly aware of how little space idols are given to grow. Some feel relieved that what was always human is finally acknowledged. All of these reactions coexist, and none of them are fully wrong. What surprises most people is how quickly the extremes fade. Outrage burns hot, but it also burns fast. The internet thrives on novelty, not permanence. After the first rush of reaction, attention begins to shift. Other stories emerge. Other names trend. Other emotions replace the initial intensity. What remains is quieter, but more important. Real conversations begin. Fans who stay are not the ones who never felt disappointed. They are the ones who learned how to hold disappointment without turning it into punishment. They are the ones who realize that admiration does not require ownership. That connection does not require control. This is where the difference between imagined loss and actual loss becomes clear. The imagined loss is total. The fear suggests that everything will disappear at once. That support will evaporate. That respect will turn into rejection. That the ground will drop away. The actual loss is selective. Some people leave. Some step back. Some disengage quietly. And that is painful. There is no reason to pretend otherwise. Losing any form of connection hurts, especially when it once meant something real. But something else happens at the same time. The connections that remain become more honest. The support that stays is no longer conditional on illusion. It is grounded in reality. It does not demand that you stay the same forever. It allows for complexity. It allows for adulthood. The media narrative also shifts once the initial shock passes. What begins as speculation slowly turns into analysis. The tone changes from accusation to interpretation, from outrage to context, from "what does this mean" to "what does this reveal?" Marriage stops being treated as a scandal and starts being treated as a signal. A signal that the industry is changing, even if slowly. A signal that idols are aging into new phases of life. A signal that the boundaries between fantasy and reality are being renegotiated. This does not happen because the system wants it to. It happens because reality eventually demands recognition. Behind the scenes, the response is quieter but more revealing. The conversations become less hypothetical. Risk is reassessed. Scenarios are updated. The fear of collapse gives way to practical observation. And what is observed is this: the world does not end. The machine adjusts. It always does. Schedules continue, music continues, performances continue, fans continue to show up. The fear domino effect rarely falls the way people imagine. Losses happen, but they are not absolute. Change happens, but it is not annihilation. What changes most is leverage. Once you speak honestly and survive it, fear loses some of its power. The unknown becomes known. The imagined catastrophe becomes a lived experience, and lived experience is easier to stand inside than endless anticipation. This is the part no one talks about enough. Courage is not proven by avoiding consequences. It is proven by realizing that the consequences were never as total as the fear suggested. That realization does not make the journey easy, but it makes it possible. The public begins to recalibrate its expectations. Slowly, imperfectly, but noticeably. Marriage becomes one chapter instead of a defining rupture. Identity becomes layered instead of fixed. You are no longer only who people projected onto you. You are also who you chose to become. There is relief in that, a quiet relief that does not trend but settles deep. The relief of alignment. The relief of no longer splitting yourself into acceptable parts. The relief of knowing that whatever remains is real. This is where strength rebuilds itself, not in defiance but in stability, not in noise but in grounded presence. You learn that honesty does not remove pressure entirely, but it redistributes it. You are no longer carrying the weight of pretense alone. The truth, once spoken, carries some of that weight for you. And that changes how you move forward. You stop bracing for impact at every step. You stop rehearsing explanations for a future that has already arrived. You start living inside your decisions instead of circling around them. Marriage in this light is not an ending. It is a recalibration, a shift from imagined futures to chosen ones, from performance-driven identity to lived identity. And as the noise fades, something important becomes clear. The fear that once felt enormous was built on uncertainty, not inevitability. Once uncertainty is replaced by experience, it loses its sharpest edge. What remains is not perfection. It is not universal approval. It is not simplicity. What remains is something far more durable. After the noise settles, after the fear loses its sharpest edge, life does not pause to acknowledge the moment. It continues, quietly, steadily, and that continuation is where the future begins to reveal itself, not as a dramatic reinvention but as a grounded evolution. This is the part that is hardest to imagine from the outside. People expect either triumph or collapse. They look for clear victories or obvious losses. But real life rarely moves in straight lines. It adapts. The days after honesty feel different, not because everything has changed, but because something fundamental has aligned. You wake up without rehearsing who you need to be. You speak without calculating how far your words can travel. You move forward without constantly scanning the horizon for consequences that have already arrived and passed. That internal shift changes how you approach everything else. Music stops feeling like an obligation to maintain an image and starts feeling like a language again. Creativity loosens when it is no longer tasked with compensating for silence elsewhere. The work does not become smaller, it becomes more intentional. You begin choosing projects not only for how they will be received, but for how they reflect where you actually are. That does not mean abandoning ambition. It means redefining it. Ambition no longer means endless expansion. It means sustainability. It means depth. It means longevity that includes a life, not replaces it. The industry, as it always does, adjusts around this shift. Some doors close quietly. Others open in ways you did not anticipate. Opportunities appear that are built on trust rather than control. Collaborations form that value perspective over fantasy. The pace changes, and that change is not loss. It is maturity. There is a difference between slowing down and settling into yourself. The first is framed as decline. The second is growth. The industry struggles to tell them apart, but artists feel the difference immediately. Marriage, or the choice of permanence in any form, brings grounding. It creates an anchor that fame alone cannot provide. An anchor that does not demand applause or validation to exist. That stability becomes a counterweight to the volatility of public life. And with that counterweight, resilience grows. Criticism still exists. Expectations do not disappear, but they no longer define the center of gravity. Your life stops orbiting around reaction and starts orbiting around intention. This is where the meaning of freedom changes. Freedom is not the absence of constraint. Every life has structure. Every choice has consequence. Freedom is the ability to choose which constraints you accept consciously, rather than inheriting them silently. For a long time, idols are taught that freedom is something you earn after success, after the right moment, after the right approval. But that version of freedom is always postponed because it depends on conditions you do not control. Real freedom is quieter. It is the freedom to grow older without apology. It is the freedom to commit without secrecy. It is the freedom to let your life expand beyond what strangers imagined for you. This does not mean distancing yourself from fans. It means redefining the relationship. Connection becomes less about fantasy and more about respect, less about access and more about understanding. Some fans grow with you, some do not. That is not a failure. It is a reflection of different stages of life intersecting. The ones who stay are not staying for who you used to be. They are staying for who you are becoming. And that kind of support, while sometimes quieter, is more stable. It does not collapse when the narrative shifts. Looking forward, the future stops feeling like a fragile thing that must be protected from reality. It becomes something you participate in actively. Plans are no longer tentative in the same way. Choices are no longer endlessly delayed. You begin living in chapters instead of holding everything open-ended. And there is peace in that structure. Not a dramatic peace, not a perfect peace, but a steady one, the kind that allows you to breathe without checking whether breathing is permitted. If there is one truth I want to leave here, it is this. Marriage in Korea or anywhere else is not the end of an idol's story. It is not betrayal. It is not disappearance. It is not abandonment. It is a transition. A transition that reveals which parts of the system are flexible and which are not, which connections are conditional and which are real, which fears were imagined and which challenges are manageable. What defines the future is not whether you choose love, but whether you are allowed to live honestly inside that choice. And honesty, once chosen, has a momentum of its own. It teaches you that your life does not need to remain hypothetical to stay meaningful, that growth does not require permission, that the world can adjust to reality faster than fear suggests. I am not speaking to demand agreement. I am speaking to offer clarity, because clarity, even when uncomfortable, is kinder than silence that slowly erases the person living inside it. This is not a declaration of rebellion. It is a declaration of presence, of choosing to exist fully, not partially, of choosing continuity, not suspension, of choosing a life that moves forward, even when the path is uncertain. That is what really happens. Not collapse, not disappearance, not the end.